He was renovating an old house, but one evening he noticed that something was wrong with the sofa. When he removed the upholstery, he found something inside that no one was supposed to see, a secret that had been watching him for years. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments where you are watching from. The truck rumbled down the narrow Indiana road, gravel crunching under the tires, a low hum blending with the sigh of wind through cornfields. The sky hung pale and washed out, the kind that promised neither rain nor warmth, and the smell of damp earth drifted in through the cracked window. Eric Miller gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his calloused fingers steady, though the weight in his chest hadn't lifted since the day he left the city. It had been almost 2 years since he'd taken on a real project. 2 years of odd jobs and quiet mornings that stretched too long. But this, he told himself, was different. This wasn't about the money, though he needed it badly enough. This was about proving to himself that he could still build something that lasted. The old house appeared at the end of the road, half hidden by bare trees and the remains of a wire fence leaning in on itself. It was 2 stories high, its paint peeled into uneven flakes that exposed the gray ribs of the wood beneath. The porch sagged, the roof shingles curled like paper, and one of the upstairs windows was cracked in a spiderweb of lines that caught the dull light. A place forgotten, unloved. Yet to Eric's eyes, it had the quiet dignity of something that had survived. He parked the truck, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, staring through the windshield. His breath fogged the glass, and in that brief blur, the house seemed to breathe back at him. He stepped out, the crunch of gravel under his boots loud in the silence. The air was heavy with the smell of old leaves and rain-soaked wood. Somewhere far off, a dog barked. He pulled his jacket tighter around him and took the first step toward the porch. The boards creaked under his weight, the sound deep and hollow, like a sigh that had been waiting for years to be released. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint, sharp scent of mildew. Light filtered weakly through the blinds, laying pale stripes across the floorboards. Everything was still, the way rooms get when they've forgotten what it means to be lived in. The furniture was heavy and practical, the kind people used to buy when they expected it to last a lifetime. There was a square wooden table, scratched, but solid, a tall clock in the corner whose hands had stopped long ago, and shelves cluttered with yellowed books and empty frames. The silence pressed in, close and steady. Eric ran a hand over the back of a chair, feeling the smoothness worn into the wood by decades of use. He imagined the man who had lived here, someone who probably ate alone, slept early, and didn't open the door for visitors. The lawyer had said the owner, a man named Walter Darren, had no family left. The house had gone to the bank, and the bank wanted it fixed before it went on the market. That was all. Simple work. Patch the roof, fix the wiring, replace the windows, maybe sand the floors if he felt generous. A small job, the kind that would have bored him once. But now it felt like exactly what he needed, a beginning. He moved through the house slowly, mapping its layout. The kitchen was small, its sink rusted, the faucet dripping a slow rhythm into a pot left behind. The bathroom door stuck halfway open, and the mirror above the sink had fogged from years of neglect. Upstairs, the room smelled of stale air and loneliness. One of them still had a single unmade bed, a lamp on the nightstand, and a cup half filled with hardened dust where water had once been. It made him uneasy, that unfinished human trace, as though the house hadn't accepted that its inhabitant was gone. When he came back down, he noticed the sofa. It sat in the center of the living room under a wide front window. The fabric faded into a color that was hard to name, something between olive and ash. The cushions sagged, the armrests were frayed, and the legs bore scratches deep enough to tell a story. Still, there was something about it that made him pause. The rest of the furniture looked as old as the house, but the sofa didn't belong. It wasn't antique. It was newer, maybe 10 or 15 years old, and yet it looked tired, as though it had outlived its welcome. He made a note to move it later. For now, he left it where it was. That night, he stayed in the upstairs bedroom, too exhausted to drive back to town. He rolled out his sleeping bag on the floor and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The house made noises, small and familiar. Wood settling, wind pressing against the siding, the occasional rattle from somewhere deep inside the walls. It should have comforted him. He'd spent years working in old places like this. He knew their voices. But something about this house felt different. The silence wasn't empty. It was waiting. He turned over and tried to sleep, but the thought lingered. The house was listening. Morning light woke him, thin, colorless. It spilled across the walls in lines that made the wallpaper's cracks look deeper. He got up stiffly, boiled coffee in a dented pot he found in the kitchen, and stepped outside to breathe the cold air. The world was still. Even the trees seemed to hold their breath. He told himself he was imagining things, that solitude could make a man hear ghosts where there were none. But when he went back inside, the air felt heavier again, as if the house had noticed his return. He spent the day inspecting the structure, marking repairs. The porch needed reinforcement. The staircase leaned slightly, and the back door frame had warped. He took notes on everything, methodical, focused. Work had always been his refuge. With tools in his hands, the noise in his mind quieted. The noise that had followed him since the accident, since his brother's voice stopped echoing beside him on the scaffolding. The rhythm of measuring, cutting, hammering, it made the world make sense again. By evening, he had drawn a full plan for the restoration. He would start with the roof, then move inside. He liked order, liked knowing what came next. When the sun dipped low, he sat in the living room, sketching designs by the weak glow of a lamp. The sofa caught his eye again. It looked uglier in the lamplight, its fabric dull, seams loose, one of the cushions slumped unevenly. He leaned back in his chair and stared at it, wondering what kind of man would buy something like that. Maybe it had sentimental value. Maybe it had been a gift. Or maybe it had just been the only place left to sit. He set his papers aside and walked over to it. The air around it smelled faintly musty, with a trace of something metallic underneath, like rust or old tools. He pressed a hand against one of the cushions, and the springs groaned. The sound echoed faintly through the room. He gave a dry laugh and shook his head. "You're on the list," he muttered. The sofa didn't look salvageable, but he might strip it down, use the frame for something else. He always hated waste. He turned off the lamp and went upstairs. But sleep came harder this time. He drifted in and out, jolted awake by sounds that might have been the wind, or might not. At one point, he was certain he heard a faint click like a switch being turned on. He lay there listening, every muscle tight. The house was silent again. Too silent. Finally, exhaustion pulled him under, but even in dreams he felt watched. The next day passed quickly. He cleared the porch, fixed a section of the gutter, and swept out the garage. The motion steadied him, and by afternoon he felt almost at peace again. He told himself he would move the sofa tomorrow. Maybe he'd drag it outside, leave it for the garbage truck. But that night, as he walked past it with his flashlight, he thought he saw something glint from beneath the frame. He bent down, squinting, and saw a flash of metal deep inside the torn fabric. He frowned, pressed the beam closer, and caught sight of a small, circular shape, the edge of a lens. For a moment, his mind didn't register what he was seeing. Then the realization hit him with a jolt, so sharp it left his mouth dry. A lens, embedded inside the sofa. He stepped back quickly, his heart hammering. The beam of the flashlight trembled across the floor. He tried to think logically. Maybe it was part of the frame, a decorative stud, a trick of the light. But no, he had seen glass. He crouched again, peeled back a bit of the fabric with his utility knife, and froze. There it was. A tiny black camera fixed deep within the padding, its eye blank and cold. The surface was dusty but intact, the wires running neatly into the frame. Someone had hidden it there carefully, deliberately. Eric sat back on his heels, breathing hard. The house was silent again, but it no longer felt empty. He couldn't explain it, but he felt seen, as though the camera had already done its job. He reached out and pulled the wires free, his hands unsteady. For a second, he thought he saw a faint red blink, like the ghost of a signal dying. Then, nothing. He set the small device on the table and stared at it until the room blurred around him. That night, he couldn't eat. He sat at the table long after the light outside had faded, staring at the black shape in front of him, a camera hidden in furniture. Why? Who would put it there? Not the old man. He didn't strike Eric as the type to install anything more complicated than a light bulb. It had to be someone else. Maybe whoever had come to the house before him. Maybe someone still coming back. He stood finally, walked to the door, and checked the locks. Once, twice, 3 times. The bolt slid with a heavy clack each time, but the sound didn't comfort him. He turned off the lamp and went upstairs, his steps slow. In the darkness behind him, the sofa sat unmoving under the window. But as he glanced back one last time, it looked different. Larger, almost. Like a shadow stretching in the faint light from the street. He shut the door and lay down fully clothed, his pulse still thudding in his ears. The house groaned once, low and distant. He told himself it was just the wind, but deep down, he no longer believed it. The morning came gray and still, as if the light itself was reluctant to enter the house. Eric woke with a stiffness that went deeper than muscle, the kind that came from unease rather than labor. He sat up slowly, his back against the wall, staring at the small rectangle of light seeping through the thin curtains. For a long while he didn't move. The memory of the previous night was vivid, sharper than any dream, the camera glinting under the torn fabric, the faint red blink before it died. When he finally forced himself downstairs, the house felt heavier, as though the air had thickened overnight. The camera still lay on the table where he had left it. Its black surface caught the light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like an eye pretending to sleep. He made coffee, the smell bitter and grounding, but it did little to calm him. He tried to shake the thought that the camera had been active when he found it. The idea that it might have recorded him, that it could have transmitted something, gnawed at the back of his mind. He kept glancing toward it, waiting for it to move, though he knew it wouldn't. After breakfast, he told himself he'd throw it out. It was just a piece of plastic and wire, useless now. He had a job to do, and the sooner he focused on that, the sooner he could get out of this house. But when he picked it up to drop it in the trash, something stopped him. There was weight in it, not just physical, but symbolic, as though discarding it would mean pretending none of it had happened. He set it back on the table. Outside, the day had turned wet. A fine mist clung to the windows, blurring the world into a washed-out watercolor. Eric spent the morning sanding door frames, checking beams, trying to lose himself in the rhythm of his work. But his focus kept slipping. Every creak of the floorboards made him look up. The house had always made sounds, but now they felt intentional. Once, while replacing nails near the window, he caught sight of something reflected in the glass, a flicker of movement behind him. He spun around, but the room was empty. Just his tools, the sofa, and the echo of his breath. He stopped for lunch and sat at the kitchen table, his sandwich untouched. The quiet was almost mocking now. When he finally got up to pour himself a glass of water, he noticed something odd. The refrigerator's hum was constant, steady, yet when he opened it, he heard a faint ticking sound behind the wall. He froze, pressing his ear closer. The tick came in intervals, mechanical, like a small motor buried inside the plaster. He tried to laugh it off. Old wiring, maybe. Faulty appliances. This house was full of quirks. But a voice in the back of his mind whispered otherwise. He finished the day's work early, cleaned his hands at the sink, and went back to the living room. The camera seemed to have shifted slightly, though he couldn't tell if it was his imagination. He crouched beside the sofa again, examining the spot where he'd found it. The hole he'd cut was still open, and inside he saw the faint edge of another shape, something smaller, wedged deep between the wood and the padding. He pulled at the fabric, careful not to tear it further, and his fingers brushed metal again. When he drew it out, he found a digital recorder, small and rectangular, its surface sticky with age. He hesitated, then turned it on. The screen blinked weakly, the numbers lighting up for a moment before fading. But it worked. At first there was only static. Then a man's voice came through, muffled, strained, as if he were speaking from far away. "I told you," it said, the tone thick with exhaustion. "I told you I'd get it back. Just give me more time." A pause followed, and then another voice, lower, smooth, too calm. "You're out of time. You think we don't know what's in the house?" The static swallowed the rest. Eric turned it off, his pulse quickening. His first thought was that the voices belonged to the previous owner, Walter Darren, and whoever had installed the camera. But what were they talking about? Money? Secrets? He set the recorder down, but his hands wouldn't stop trembling. That night, he didn't sleep upstairs. He pulled a chair into the corner of the living room and sat near the cold fireplace, a lamp casting weak light across the floor. The sofa stood across from him, its gutted underside hidden in shadow. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was watching him. Once or twice, he thought he heard faint clicks again, but when he checked the windows and the doors, everything was locked. The rain outside had turned steady, pattering softly against the roof. The sound should have been soothing, but instead it reminded him of static, the same static that filled the gaps between those voices. He turned off the lamp and sat in the dark for a long time, listening to the house breathe. In the morning, exhaustion dulled his thoughts, but determination took their place. If there was one thing Eric understood, it was structure. Houses told their stories through construction, the lines of wiring, the joints of beams, the secrets in their walls. If someone had hidden one camera, there might be others. He spent the day searching, his flashlight cutting through dust and cobwebs. Behind the bookshelf, he found a drilled hole, small and round, the kind used for running wires. In the corner near the ceiling, he spotted a patch where the paint was newer. He pried it off and found another cable, cut and coiled. The realization hit him slowly but firmly. The house had been wired for surveillance. Whoever had lived here had either been watching or being watched. As he worked, he tried to piece together what kind of man Walter Darren had been. The lawyer had described him as private, quiet, maybe a little eccentric. The neighbors hadn't said much more, just that he rarely spoke, rarely left, that lights sometimes burned in the house all night. Now Eric wondered if the man had even been living alone. The thought made his skin prickle. By evening, he was exhausted, but restless. He couldn't bring himself to leave. Something in him needed to understand, to see it through. He sat down again with the recorder. The second file began with the sound of footsteps. Then came the scrape of a chair, the sigh of someone sitting. "They said I can't move it," the first voice murmured. "Said it stays until it's done." A soft chuckle followed from the other voice, darker this time. "It's not about moving it. It's about what's inside." Then static again, and silence. Eric turned it off and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His mind raced through possibilities. Hidden valuables? A smuggling ring? He'd worked in enough shady neighborhoods to know people hid strange things in their homes. But the tone of those voices, it wasn't greed. It was control. It was threat. And it fit with what he'd seen. A camera in a sofa, wires in the walls, a house designed to observe. When night came, he told himself not to stay another night there. He would pack his things and head to a motel in town. Yet when he stood by the door, hand on the handle, something made him pause. It was that same tug of unfinished work, the same feeling that had made him return to building after all those years. The house wasn't just an assignment anymore. It was a puzzle, and part of him was trapped in it. He turned away from the door and climbed the stairs. The old boards creaked beneath his weight, but the sound didn't startle him anymore. It almost felt like acknowledgement, a conversation between the living and the house itself. Sleep came only in short bursts, interrupted by the same dream. His brother's voice calling him from somewhere inside the walls, muffled and fading. He woke before dawn, drenched in sweat. Downstairs, the air was colder than before, carrying the faint scent of wet earth. He followed it to the basement. The door had swollen slightly, but it opened with a groan. His flashlight beam sliced through the darkness, revealing stone walls slick with moisture and shelves covered in dust. Something glimmered near the far corner, a strip of metal embedded in the concrete floor. He knelt, brushed away debris, and found what looked like a sealed hatch. The edges were rough, but the cement over it was newer than the rest of the floor. It took him nearly an hour to break through. The hammer blows echoed like gunshots in the small space. When he finally pried it open, a small metal container lay beneath, wrapped in a plastic sheet. Inside he found a hard drive, a few old photographs, and a bundle of bills stuck together by dampness. The photos were of people he didn't recognize, men in suits, standing in this very living room. Their faces were stern, watchful. On the back of one photo, written in faint ink, were the words, "If I disappear, look inside the sofa." His breath caught. The handwriting was shaky but deliberate. Walter Darren had left a message. He had known what would happen. Eric sat there in the dim light, the hum of the refrigerator upstairs echoing faintly through the floorboards. His hands were gray with dust, but he barely noticed. He felt as though he were sitting at the heart of something far larger than himself. This wasn't just paranoia. The house had been part of something organized, planned, controlled. The recordings, the cameras, the hatch, they all pointed to a system of surveillance that extended beyond these walls. He thought of the ticking he'd heard behind the refrigerator, the car lights that had passed outside late at night. Maybe they weren't random. Maybe someone had come back to check. That night, the wind picked up, shaking the shutters. Eric sealed the hatch and climbed back upstairs, carrying the container with him. He placed it on the table beside the camera and the recorder. The three objects looked harmless, but together they felt like evidence pieces of a story that someone had tried to bury. He poured himself a drink, the first in weeks, and sat watching the window. The yard outside was pitch black, the trees swaying like shadows. Every sound made him tense. The groan of a branch, the scratch of leaves against the glass. Once, he thought he heard the gate creak. He went still, listening. Then came soft footsteps on the gravel path. He stood quickly, knocking the glass over, its contents spilling across the floor. He grabbed his flashlight and moved toward the door, careful not to make a sound. When he flicked on the light, the yard was empty. Only rain and the faint impression of footprints in the mud near the porch steps. They led toward the road, but didn't return. He stayed awake until dawn, sitting with his back to the wall, the recorder in his lap, waiting for another sound. None came. The house was silent, but it wasn't peace. It was the silence of a held breath. When morning finally broke, pale and colorless, he looked out through the streaked window and saw the footprints had already faded. The air smelled of rain and soil. He turned toward the sofa, its torn fabric drooping like an open wound, and felt a wave of anger, not fear this time, but defiance. Whoever had done this, whatever purpose this house had served, it would end here. He gathered the devices, placed them carefully in a bag, and sat down at the table. His mind was clear now, the decision already made. He would take everything to the police. He wasn't built for mysteries or secrets. He built homes, not traps. But before he could reclaim this place, he needed to expose the truth of what had lived inside it. As he sat there, the light shifted across the room, touching the dust on the floor, the torn sofa, the cracked glass of the old clock. The house no longer felt like it was waiting. It felt like it was holding its breath for what came next. The morning light crept into the house with a cautious tenderness, slipping through the dusty blinds and painting thin lines across the kitchen table. Eric sat there in silence, his hands wrapped around a cold mug of coffee he had long since stopped drinking. The bag with the camera, recorder, and metal container rested at his feet like an anchor. He had barely slept. Every noise, every whisper of the old wood had kept him alert through the night, until exhaustion had settled into his bones. Now, as dawn spread its muted colors across the walls, he felt something unfamiliar rising within him, not fear, but resolve. The decision he'd made before sunrise was final. He would drive into town, walk into the nearest police station, and hand over everything he had found. Whatever this was, it was bigger than him. And if Walter Darren had died trying to expose it, Eric wasn't about to let it end the same way. He gathered the items carefully, wrapping them in an old towel, and placed the bundle on the passenger seat of his truck. The road into town was still damp from the night's rain, and mist clung to the edges of the trees. As the truck bumped along the uneven road, Eric found himself glancing into the rearview mirror more than usual, half expecting to see headlights following him. But the road behind remained empty. When he reached the police station, a low, square building beside a convenience store, he parked by the curb and sat for a moment, gripping the steering wheel. His heart thudded with an intensity that surprised him. He had faced collapsing roofs and electrical fires in his career, yet this simple act, handing over a few objects, felt like stepping into a storm. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and paper. A young officer at the desk looked up, his expression polite but wary. Eric introduced himself, explained briefly that he had been hired to repair an old house and had discovered hidden recording devices inside. At first, the officer's skepticism was obvious. "You're saying you found a camera in the furniture?" he asked, as if confirming the absurdity. But when Eric set the bundle on the counter and unwrapped it, the man's tone changed. He called for someone from the back, and soon another officer appeared, older, with the weary steadiness of someone who had seen enough to know that truth often sounded unbelievable. They took Eric to a small room, where he repeated the story from the beginning. The house, the sofa, the recordings, the hatch in the basement. As he spoke, he felt his voice tighten with emotion. Not fear now, but something heavier. The residue of nights spent under invisible scrutiny. The officers listened carefully, one taking notes, the other examining the items. When they connected the recorder to a small speaker, the first voice crackled through Walter's desperate, trembling tone, followed by the calm, controlled menace of the other man. The room went still. Even the hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. When the clip ended, the older officer exchanged a glance with his partner and nodded. They asked Eric to leave the equipment with them for examination and promised to contact him soon. Outside, the air felt clearer, lighter. For the first time since he'd arrived in that town, Eric could breathe without the weight pressing on his chest. He drove back slowly, the morning sun breaking through the mist, scattering pale gold across the fields. But as the house came into view, the old unease returned, not because he was afraid, but because he felt bound to it now. He couldn't just abandon it to the bank. It was a place that had witnessed something terrible, and now it needed to be rebuilt, not erased. When he stepped out of the truck, the front door creaked softly in the wind, as though greeting him. For a long time he stood there, looking at the weathered walls, the peeling paint, the broken gutter swaying slightly. Then, quietly, he said aloud, "All right, let's finish this." He began by clearing the debris from the yard, pulling up weeds, tossing rotted boards into a pile. The work steadied him. Each motion, each sound of hammer and saw, began to replace the memories of whispers and fear with the rhythm of labor. As he worked, he thought of his brother, how they had built their first house together, laughing under the summer sun, their hands blistered but proud. The thought no longer hurt the way it once did. It felt like something returned to him, like a small light rekindled in the fog. By afternoon, he had patched the porch, replaced 2 cracked windows, and begun sanding the main door. He paused only once, glancing toward the living room window, where the sofa still sat in its old place. Its presence seemed to anchor everything that had happened, the silent witness to the story that had nearly consumed him. That evening, he dragged it out onto the porch. The effort left him breathless, but he didn't stop until the sofa stood under the open sky. Its torn fabric flapped faintly in the breeze. Eric stared at it for a long time, his hands resting on his knees. This thing had watched people suffer, had carried the secrets of men who used fear as a weapon. It didn't deserve to remain. He fetched an axe from the truck and struck the first blow, the wood cracking with a hollow sound that echoed into the field. It took several more strikes before the frame gave way, exposing the springs and padding within. When it was done, he gathered the remains, poured lighter fluid over them, and set them aflame. The fire rose high, orange against the fading blue of the evening. For a moment, the light flickered across the house's facade, illuminating the cracks and shadows. Looked almost alive. Eric stood until the last ember dimmed, then turned back toward the porch, his face streaked with sweat and ash, but his mind calm. Over the next week, he threw himself into the restoration completely. Each morning began before sunrise. Each evening ended when the last sliver of daylight disappeared. He rebuilt the railing, sealed the roof, repainted the walls. He replaced the warped planks in the hallway, stripped the old wallpaper, and laid fresh varnish across the floors until they glowed faintly under the lamps. The silence of the house changed. It was no longer the silence of watchfulness, but of rest. Where once every sound had made him flinch, now the soft groans of settling wood felt like a conversation. Honest, harmless. He began to hum while he worked, an old habit from his younger days, and the tune seemed to fill the rooms with something human again. A few days later, the police called. The older officer told him that the devices and the hard drive had confirmed his suspicions. The house had been used as part of a small surveillance network, tied to a ring of extortionists who had recorded private meetings of officials and businessmen. Walter Darren, it seemed, had stumbled into their operation when he rented out part of his property for equipment testing. When he discovered the truth, he tried to expose them. The group forced him into silence, and when he refused to cooperate, he died. Whether by heart failure or something more deliberate, the officer didn't say. "You did the right thing bringing it in," the man told him. "Most wouldn't have." Eric thanked him, though the words felt small compared to the gravity of it all. When he hung up, he looked around the kitchen and exhaled deeply. The house had been a trap, a tool, a cage. Now it would be something else. He finished the last of the repairs 2 days later. The house looked different. Not new, but dignified. Like an old soldier cleaned of the grime of war, the paint on the porch shone faintly in the afternoon sun, and the front door, now a deep walnut color, stood solid and straight. Inside, the air smelled of sawdust and fresh varnish. He placed the few remaining pieces of furniture carefully, a table near the window, a chair beside it, and a new sofa plain, sturdy, covered in pale fabric that reflected the light. He ran his hand over the armrest, testing the firmness. It creaked softly, reassuringly. Nothing hidden, nothing watching. Just a place to sit. When the work was done, he didn't leave. He told the bank he wanted to buy the house himself. They were surprised but didn't argue. After all, who else would want it? Within weeks, the papers were signed. He moved in with little more than his tools, a mattress, and a few clothes. The neighbors began to wave when he passed. One of them, Mrs. Doris, brought him a pie and told him it was good to see the lights on again. "That house needed someone like you," she said softly. He smiled, though he wasn't sure what she meant. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps some places simply needed a steady hand to remind them of their purpose. At night, he sat on the porch, the sound of crickets rising from the fields. The sky stretched wide and unbroken above him, stars trembling faintly in the cool air. Sometimes, he thought about the men whose voices he'd heard on the recordings, their arrogance, their certainty that no one would ever know. He wondered if they had families, if they slept soundly. Then he thought of Walter Darren, sitting alone in that same room, terrified and defiant, leaving behind clues for someone he would never meet. Eric hoped, in some quiet way, that the man knew his truth had finally been seen. He lifted his coffee in a silent toast to the night, to the house, to the memory of a stranger who refused to surrender. As weeks passed, the days found their rhythm. The mornings came golden and clean, the afternoons filled with the hum of cicadas. Eric planted a small garden behind the house, built a new fence, and repaired the mailbox. He no longer jumped at creaks or shadows. The house felt like his now, solid under his hands, grounded in something honest. The pain he had carried, the guilt over his brother's death, the years of drifting began to loosen its hold. Sometimes, while sanding a beam or tightening a hinge, he would catch himself smiling without reason. The sound of the hammer, the smell of wood dust, the creak of new boards settling. All of it was music again. One evening, as the sun melted behind the horizon, he wrote a letter. The paper was rough beneath his pen, the ink uneven. It wasn't addressed to anyone who could answer. "I'm building again," he wrote. "Not just walls. Myself." He folded it neatly and placed it in a small frame on the mantel. It sat there, quiet and unassuming, like a promise made to the air. When night fell, he walked outside. The wind was cool, carrying the scent of pine and soil. The house stood behind him, its windows glowing softly with warm light. For the first time, it looked alive, not haunted, not hollow, but awake. He turned toward it one last time before heading inside and thought that maybe, in its own way, the house had been waiting for him all along, not to repair it, but to let it breathe again. Inside, he switched off the lights and sat on the new sofa. The floorboards creaked beneath his boots, familiar, harmless. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the passage of ordinary time. He leaned back, closed his eyes, and felt a stillness settle over him, a stillness that wasn't emptiness, but peace. The house, once burdened by its ghosts, was silent now, and in that silence, Eric finally heard something he hadn't in years. It was the sound of his own heart, steady and sure, beating in rhythm with the home he had freed. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are so many more stories to discover. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Some stories are too powerful to keep to yourself.